Which is the best HEMA federschwert? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've got something really quite unusual and also quite special and something that you can't achieve very often for you today. So this is a review between three very popular brands of feder or federschwert. Before I go on, I should state that these have been given to me. So this is in a sense a sponsored video. But that being said, it's completely and utterly impartial. Okay, so these have been given to me by an anonymous source, and we have here a Sigi forge feder. We have a Regenyei, Regenyei Armory feder, and a Kvetun Armory feder. And these are three very, very popular brands. Now, obviously, there are lots of other brands out there, but these are three of the kind of quality and widely used feders currently in HEMA, certainly in Europe. And so I'm going to do a comparison between these three, and we're going to look at everything to do with length, mass, balance, the way they flex, what type of tips they've got, their grips, the whole shebang. So hopefully this will be a useful comparative exercise for you if you're thinking about buying one of these brands of feder, or indeed if you have a different brand, you can compare the data I give for these with yours or with one that you're looking at buying. To add a tiny bit more context, I should add in here that I've been using feders since the early 2000s when they first appeared. Pretty much the first company to start making them were Regenyei Armory, Peter Regenyei, and I bought my first one directly from Peter at the Dijon event back in the day. I should also point out any kind of bias here. So first of all, I think that I'm going to be completely impartial. If you've watched any of my other reviews, you'll know that if something's not great, I will slate it. If something's amazing, I will say so. And if something's good but there's constructive feedback or changes I would make, I would say that as well. So I am impartial. But in terms of these three manufacturers, this one is Kvetun. So full disclosure, I do have a working arrangement with Kvetun. Okay, I've developed the Easton Mark III model saber with Kvetun, and I know Alex fairly well, not face to face, but certainly through the internet. So I do have a relationship with Kvetun to disclose. Secondly, Regenyei Armory. I also have a relationship. I have previously developed a saber with Regenyei Armory. It's not in production now. But I have owned a number of Regenyei swords. Peter Regenyei has traded at my event, Fight Camp, and I know him as an individual going all the way back to the early 2000s. So I also have a relationship there. So if you want to class that as biased, then so be it. The third one, Sigi Forge. So I know the people involved with the company, but I don't have a direct connection with this company. So theoretically, I have less. If you think I have any prejudice, I have less kind of bias towards the Sigi Forge sword. But that being said, honestly, I'm completely impartial. I'm going to compare these like for like. Also, to add credence to that last statement, I would say that on the surface of it, I've had these for a while. And I should throw in there an apologies to the people that have sent this to me. So obviously pandemic, flood in this garage where I film, and various other things, illness and family have got in the way. I have had these for a while, and honestly, after having them for a while and not training with them, because training's only just recently resumed, and that's been another factor that's been involved, but having had them for a while and handled them for a while and been preparing for this review, I would say that by and large, within the great scheme of things, and I see swords coming from all over the world, sharp and blunt, these are within the same ballpark of each other. So if you particularly prefer some aspect of one of these over the others, then get that one. That is the one for you. If you prefer the shape of the Sigi Forge or the cord wrap of the Regenyei, or the price of one of them, or the ease of import of another one, and that's an important thing to note, EU, non-EU, whether you're in America or UK or wherever, there might be other factors outside of this review which steer you more towards one of these. And that's absolutely fine. Just go with it, because all of these are actually really, really good feders. They're all used widely in HEMA competition and weekly training by groups all over the world. So they're all good manufacturers. They're all good feders. And really, you could buy any of these and be happy with it. Another little detail to add, I suppose, is that I personally have owned a number of Regenyei swords over the years, including a Regenyei feder, first one I ever had and used for ages, still got it. I've also owned a Kvetun feather and various Kvetun swords over the years. I have some behind me. And I've trained with those with no issues. They're both very durable, very, very good. Okay, and so specifically in terms of federschwerts, I have trained week in, week out with a Regenyei one, week in, week out with a Kvetun one, and I've competed with both as well, and members of my club have competed with both as well. The Sigi forge to me is completely new. I have seen them at events, but I've never personally held one of the Sigi forge feathers before, but it's very nice, and we'll talk more about that in the course of this video. So when you encounter one of these feathers, the first thing that you're going to experience is spending money, and we should never underestimate what an important factor that is for people deciding, and also value for money. Okay, so what do these three feathers cost? Well, first of all, we've got the Regenyei Armory, the Peter Regenyei feather here, which comes out, this is the standard version. In fact, they do a light version, which I'm not going to talk about here because it's slightly different in a number of ways, particularly also in terms of the warranty. But in terms of the standard feather here, which you can buy through various resellers, or you can buy it directly through Regenyei Armory. If you buy it directly from Regenyei Armory, it comes out at 165 euros plus VAT. Okay, and what they do is they calculate the VAT based on wherever you are. So just grab my piece of paper here. So for the UK, for example, that would be 165 euros plus tax. If you add the 20% VAT for UK onto that, obviously your VAT may vary, that makes it 198 euros. So to compare like with like, I'm going to use what I would be paying for it in the UK, minus the shipping charges, of course, and many import tax now that we've left the EU. But this would come out at 198, so very, very close to 200 euros, okay, after adding the tax. Next up, we have the Kvetun. Now, equally, just like the Regenyei Armory one, this can be bought directly from Kvetun Armory, or it could be imported through someone like me who sometimes buys batches of things from Kvetun for the club. So I literally over there, I've got a batch of 20 sabres, Easton sabres, which soon I'll be selling to members of my club. And then if there's any left, I'll be selling to anyone else who's willing to pay for them. So anybody can import directly from Kvetun, from Russia. I should just mention briefly, Regenyei Armory is in Hungary, so it is within the EU. At the moment, Kvetun Armory is in Russia, so outside of the EU. That would make a difference to some people's tax. But you could equally buy this from a reseller, and Kvetun stock various resellers. In the UK, for example, Tempus Fugitives. So if you go to Tempus Fugitives, you won't be dealing with the import tax and the shipping costs and stuff like that. You'll just buy it directly from them, and they will have already added that onto the price. But if you buy that directly from Kvetun, that comes out at 220 euros, okay? And they just build the tax into that price. So we've got 200 euros for the Regenyei, 220 euros for the Kvetun, okay? And obviously we'll be comparing those in due course. And then finally, the Sigi forge one. So again, you can buy directly from Sigi, or you can buy from a reseller. I'm actually not sure who the resellers for Sigi forge are. I should mention also that Kvetun and Regenyei Armory are the biggest scale manufacturers of HEMA practice weapons that I'm aware of in Europe. Whereas Sigi Forge is a smaller company, but nevertheless they're still doing very well and they're turning out very good products. But these come out at 290 euros according to their website. Okay, and these are all standard models, and there are comparative sizes and weights. We'll look at the sizes and weights in a bit, bearing in mind these are the standard model for each of those companies. So we've got Regenyei coming out at about 200 if you're in the UK. This is euros. We've got Kvetun Armory coming out at 220 euros, and we've got the Sigi Forge coming out at 290 euros. So purely in percentage terms, there is quite a span there, and quite clearly Regenyei Armory are coming out the cheapest, quite notably so, and Sigi Forge are the most expensive. Kvetun are in the middle. Now let's look at the sizes, the weights, and the balance points of these three swords compared. Now, I should mention, of course, that these are all hand-built, handmade, so there's going to be slight variations between even the standard models. So if you get 10 of the standard of any of these swords, there will be slight variations between them. Secondly, these are the standard models, okay? You could, of course, get a custom one. You could ask for a longer blade, you could ask for a longer hilt, a longer crossguard, a shorter crossguard. You could have it slightly stiffer and heavier, you could have it slightly lighter. All of these, and the balance point, of course, could be changed. You could add a heavier pommel, whatever. So all of these companies will offer custom options, but these are purely the standard ones. And at that point, I should also mention, there is a question to be had, I think, about standardization of fencing weapons in HEMA. Certainly if we look at Olympic fencing, there are parameters, so there is a range between which your weapon can fall in terms of the blade length or the mass or whatever. Okay, so do we have standardization in HEMA? Well, we don't officially, no, and most competitions like longsword competitions won't even necessarily specify the size of your feather, which is a bit of a loophole when you think about it, because you could have a very light, very long feather, which will give you a rather unfair advantage. The second question to be asked about standardization is, where do we put that standardization? Do we have very noodly floppy blades? Do we have very stiff blades? Do we have feathers that are very long or somewhat short? Do we have standardization for hilt lengths, and how does that affect glove design? Blade lengths, is it fair for someone who's only got a 90 centimeter blade to be competing against someone who's got a 110 centimeter blade? This type of stuff, okay? So there is a lot, it's a very, very problematic and complicated topic. And when I compare these measurements, there is no good and bad, and there is no standard parameters that we're necessarily, there's no FIE, there's no governing body in the world that we're necessarily comparing this to. We are simply comparing three feathers which are all regarded as standard size feathers within the industry and within those companies. Right, so starting off, we've got the Regenyei feather. So just grab my piece of paper again, because I can't remember all these numbers, of course. So the Regenyei feather has got a 100 centimeter blade, is 133 centimeters length overall, and it balances at 6 centimeters from the crossguard, so just at the top of the shield. Okay, the Kvetun or Kvetun federschwert also has a 100 centimeter blade, so same as the Regenyei. It is 135 centimeters in total length, so the hilt is slightly longer than the Regenyei, and it balances at 5 centimeters, so 1 centimeter closer to the crossguard. Okay, so but very, very similar, and it should be noted that you will see that the Kvetun looks very similar to the Regenyei feather. They're very, very similar designs. And the most different of the three, in terms of the appearance at least, but not very different actually in terms of the length and balance. So this is got a 101 centimeter blade, so it's got a 1 centimeter extra blade, and it's 135 centimeters overall. So it's got the exact same hilt length as the Kvetun, which is 2 centimeters longer than the Regenyei, and it's got a 1 centimeter longer blade. So out of these three, the Sigi is very slightly longer, but you'll see their measurements are very, very similar. Oh, and the balance point to this is exactly the same as the Kvetun at 5 centimeters. So in terms of the blade length, the hilt length, and the balance point, these three swords are exceptionally close. Where they're a little bit more different, and this actually surprised me, is I've weighed these on my postal scales, and these scales are used for imports and exports primarily, all around the world of antique swords. So they're very, very super accurate to two decimal places, and the mass of these three feathers, which are not very easy to hold altogether, I'll tell you. The Regenyei, we'll start off with because that's the order we're always doing it in, is 1,470, so 1470 grams. Keep that in mind. The Kvetun, surprisingly, despite the fact it looks almost the same in terms of size and design and everything else, is 1,670 grams, 1670 grams. So 200 grams heavier. It's quite a lot heavier. The Sigi is closer to the Kvetun, but a little bit lighter at 1,635 grams, 1635 grams. So somewhat surprising to me. They are, again, roughly in the same ballpark, but the Regenyei is actually quite a bit lighter than the other two, which makes it really quite light for its size. So next up, let's have a look at the distal taper of the blades, the flex of the blades, and see if that is related in any way to the different mass of these three swords in terms of is that why they weigh different? Is it something to do with the distal taper of the blade? So let's start off with the Regenyei, as we always do. I've got my digital calipers here, and we'll look at distal taper, but we'll also look at what I call profile taper. So the taper of the blade looking this way, and the taper of the blade looking that way. So first of all, the steel stock that has been used, in other words, the thickness at the shield, is 5.2 millimeters. According to this, just check again, came out 5.1 millimeters, okay? So we're talking about just over 5 millimeters at the base of the blade. If we go to the base of the blade above the shield, it comes to 5 millimeters, okay? So let's call it close enough to 5 millimeters at the base here. If we go half the way up the blade, it's 4.4 millimeters, and just close to the tip, 3.3 millimeters, okay? So 5, 4.4, 3.3. So a fairly linear distal taper, not a huge amount of distal taper. In terms of the width of the blade, obviously I won't measure the shield. You can see the general size and shape of the shield, but the blade, the actual blade part of the blade starts at 24.9 millimeters, and it tapers down just behind the tip to 11.5. Okay, so what was that again? 24 point, hold on, it's actually coming out as 24.6 now. Yeah, 24.6, I went a bit too high up. Okay, so there you go, there's the taper you've got. Now, if we look at the flex of the blade, you'll notice if I push into the point here, it's a relatively flexible blade, but it's not super flexible. Certainly, I think it's less flexible than our sabres because it's probably got less distal taper. You'll notice that the blade flexes almost entirely in the second half of the blade, as we would expect, and it's really quite rigid up here, and that's a function of the taper in this plane and the taper in this plane. Right, let's have a look at the Kvetun. So here we've got the Kvetun, and this starts off, let's have a look at the thickness, 5.2. It's basically the same as the Regenyei, and 5.1, in fact exactly the same. Wow. So 5.2 and 5.1 exactly the same at the base of the blade as the Kvetun. Let's have a look halfway up the blade, 4.5, I think the other one was 4.4, and then up behind the tip, it's actually less, 2.9. The Regenyei I think was 3.3, so 2.9. So interesting, it starts off exactly the same thickness as the Regenyei, but actually has more distal taper, slightly more distal taper. It's slightly thinner. We're not talking about a lot here, but 0.4 of a millimeter, it's not that little either. Now, in terms of the flex, this actually feels slightly stiffer somehow, which can be a function of the steel type and the heat treatment, but let's have a look at the width of the blade. So we've got 24 exactly. So it's actually slightly narrower. We compare it side by side, yes, I can see that's the case. So it's very slightly narrower here than the Regenyei. Halfway up the blade, it's 18. I don't think I did halfway up the blade before actually with the Regenyei. And then it's 12 up near the tip. Just check the Regenyei again. The Regenyei was 11.5. They're very, very close though. So, on paper at least, why is one a lot heavier than the other? I actually don't know. So there's something to be said about the grip, and we'll look at the hilts in a minute. But the blades of the Regenyei and the Kvetun are incredibly close. So close that I would say the differences between them might not be down to the actual two makes or models, but simply down to the individual swords. And you might find that you might get another Kvetun or another Regenyei and they'd match exactly. So extremely close, very, very similar designs. I mean, the Regenyei schilt is very slightly wider than the Kvetun schilt. But the Regenyei overall is a lighter sword, 200 grams lighter, quite surprisingly so, despite the fact that the blades are almost identical. Now let's compare with the less similar Sigi forge. So the Sigi forge at the base of the blade is here, 4.9 millimeters it seems to be, so it's very slightly, maybe even 4.8, it's dithering between 4.8 and 4.9, but very slightly flatter stock, thinner stock at the base of the blade than the Regenyei in the Kvetun. If we go halfway up the blade, 3.8, so again it's slightly thinner than the other two. We'll talk about the tips in a second because this has got a slightly different tip design to the other two, but close up behind the tip, 3. So interestingly, the Sigi actually has less distal taper. It starts off very slightly thinner, and well, I guess it's still thinner than the Regenyei actually, but it's thicker than the Kvetun. So it does have distal taper. If we look at the flex, it flexes in exactly the same way, and I would say it flexes more easily, which would tally with the fact that it's thinner at the midsection of the blade. So both of those blades have, I would argue, slightly more distal taper, and they are slightly thicker at the middle of the blade than the Sigi is. Sigi actually flexes, it's still very stiff in the base of the blade, but it flexes to my feeling more easily. But we'll do a flex test in a little bit. So in terms of the width of the blade, let's go above the shilt. It's 26.3, 20.5 halfway up, and 11.3. So it's not actually very different if we just compare to the Regenyei again for a second. It's very slightly broader up the middle of the blade and towards the tip. But overall, if we ignore the very different shilt, because obviously the Sigi forge has a much shorter shilt, and it's a similar width, but it's a different shape. So there's less material, there's less mass in that shilt. But the blade itself is very, very similar to the Regenyei, but very slightly broader, but thinner. But remember, the mass of the blade is dictated not only by the distal taper, but also the width as well. So we're talking about mass, the amount of steel in the blade. Again, if we compare to the Kvetun, it's the same comparison as with the Regenyei. It is very slightly broader, but very slightly thinner. So to look at visually, the Sigi forge, despite the fact it has a smaller shilt, actually has a very slightly broader blade. Now, I did say we'd talk a little bit about the tip design, and tip design, believe it or not, particularly amongst longsworders, is quite a hot topic, and some people have very strong views about it. I actually don't have strong views about it, although I do have a preference, and we'll talk about that here. I'll try and be as brief as possible because this isn't obviously a video all about tip design, but I could do a whole video talking about practice sword tip design. So in very simple terms, the Kvetun and the Regenyei, this is the Kvetun, but the Regenyei looks the same, have what are called rolled tips. And you can see there, the tip of the blade is literally hot forged, rolled over and folded in on itself, leaving a hollow tube. The Sigi has what's known as a flared tip, okay, where it flares. Some flare out this way, some don't, but they pretty much all flare out that way, okay? So they get thicker, so you end up with a little solid bar section at the end. Now, each of these have pros and cons. Some people really hate rolled tips because they've had a rolled tip break on them, and I have seen maybe 3 rolled tips break in my entire HEMA life, I have to say. So on well-forged swords that have been normalised and well heat-treated, it shouldn't happen, but it does occasionally happen that something gets under the rolled tip and basically bends it backwards on itself and fractures it, work hardens across the top and it breaks. So rolled tips can break, yes, absolutely. It should be said though, that when the rolled tip does break, it usually leaves half a rolled tip, so it's still not a particularly offensive tip. If it breaks below the rolled tip, you can end up with a sharp blade, but that would go for the flared tip as well. That would go for any blade. Any blade that breaks in the straight part, you end up with a straight part. If the actual rolled tip itself breaks, you don't end up with a particularly offensive tip. With the flared tip, there is nothing there to break. There is simply more metal, okay? It flares out, it flares up. To my mind, there are a couple of distinct disadvantages with flared tips, okay? One of the disadvantages is it means it's a solid mass at the end of your blade, which adds inertia. The great thing about a rolled tip is it's hollow and tubular, and therefore you're not really, okay, you're folding the blade back on itself, but you don't have an awful lot of mass up there, whereas flared solid tips, if you've got a lot of distal taper, it's not so much a problem with the Sigi forged sword, but if you've got a lot of distal taper, they can make the tip very floppy, which you don't seem to get with the rolled tips. The other potential problem, and this is a potential problem that does apply to this Sigi forged sword, is if you look at the shape of this flared tip here, you'll notice that it comes outwards out to here, which means that you get these quite pointy angles here and here, which when you're striking someone's fleshy parts, if you hit something of them which is muscular rather than, you know, hard protection, that is quite a focus point. It's like a little hammer right at the tip of the sword, which I'm not a huge fan of. The other issue to mention is with the flared tip, you don't have an awful lot of surface area at the tip. So when you're thrusting someone, that is quite a small amount of surface area to contact them with. With the rolled tip, I'll just grab the Regenyei example this time. With the rolled tip, you could argue the same. You could argue that that has a hammer effect and that is still a sharp angle you're hitting them with. Indeed, it can leave a nasty bruise or welt. But with the thrust, you've got a bigger, more curved and rounded surface area. And I find the thrusts are more likely to do nasty injury, like breaking ribs and stuff like this. So actually, I find for thrusting, I find these tips safer. That being said, if you really want to make these tips as safe as possible, for whatever reason, in your club, then you can put a leather strip over and wrap it and add all sorts of tips on these. So flared tip, roll tip, it's really a matter of personal choice. Some manufacturers can offer both. So if you went to Kvetun or Regenyei, for example, they can make you a flared tip if you want one. I don't know if Sigi can do a roll tip. Some manufacturers can't do rolled tips because they don't do forging. They only make blades by stock removal and they don't really do any forging, and they wouldn't be able to do the normalizing that's required after the forging. So basically, some manufacturers can do either and some manufacturers can only do a flared tip. Now I'm going to do some schild talking. So let's talk about the schilts here. So a schild, which is just shield in German, is this section down here which fulfills a number of purposes, partly to protect the hand a bit better, partly to add mass to the blade, blah, blah, blah. We won't go into that here. But schilts come in a variety of shapes, and indeed, some practice swords in period didn't have schilts, and so not everyone uses schilts today because they're not necessarily appropriate for all styles. However, a lot of people use them for their benefits, even if they don't fit with the style they practice. So within my club, we do Fiore di Liberi, which is Italian. There is no evidence whatsoever that feathers like these were ever used in Renaissance or medieval Italy, but nevertheless we do use feathers because they're so widely used, widely available, and they have some benefits. So we do use these, we do use schilts, and we don't have any particular club preferences to the shape of schilt, which makes me relatively impartial. But again, I know that out there in the HEMA world, some people have very, very strong opinions about schilts. So some people believe that a schilt should almost have the ability to catch the opponent's blade. Some people believe the opposite, that it should be sloped downwards at the top, so opposing blades get knocked off and away from the hand, but they don't actually catch on here. Some people have strong opinions about safety in regards to how these should be shaped, and I have seen some schilts made by smaller manufacturers that are kind of almost offensive points, which is probably not a great idea in a practice weapon at the end of the day. These are not real weapons, these are foils. So there are some questions to be had about how this shape is here, whether you want it to catch the blade, whether you want the blade to slide off, whether you don't care, whether you think something looks cool or doesn't look cool, or indeed whether you're worried about whether that point might be offensive during the type of training or competition that you do. The shape of the Regenyei and the Kvetun schilts in this case are the same, but again, both those manufacturers offer a variety of different schilts and indeed schilts-less swords. So in terms of these two standard models, that is what the shape of the schilt is. If you want something different, you get something different. What Sigi Forge decided to do was something which is a little bit more ornate, and I think actually does look a lot nicer. It's a smaller schilt, and it's got decorative holes in it. And you'll notice it has a raised section in the middle, which is the thickness of the blade, and they have actually spent extra time, effort and money in essentially in grinding down those surfaces, so there's almost a little fuller between the wings, as it were. This looked like a winged spear incidentally. It looks a bit like certain types of winged spear that exist from the 9th all the way through to the 15th, 16th century. So it does look more fancy, but functionally it doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. What I would say, it covers the same breadth. Okay, so all of these schilts are about the same width. So in terms of hand protection, they should offer roughly the same hand protection. The only slight difference I noted is that between the Regenyei and the Kvetun style and the Sigi style, the Sigi style is not quite as far away from the hand. So you can see that the Regenyei one here goes higher up the blade than the Sigi does. That does theoretically mean that in certain blade actions, where you're binding on an opponent's blade, their blade could be closer to your fingers than it would be with the Regenyei or the Kvetun. Equally, we could say you could get even more hand protection, debatably, by making the schild come up even higher. So again, schild's a complicated topic. Sigi has gone with a slightly more ornate style. The only other thing that you might be thinking about the Sigi is it is more pointed, okay? And some people might have a safety issue with that. Personally, I don't think it's really a safety issue because it's so close to the crossguard. And in all of the longsword fencing I've ever been involved with or judged or watched or whatever, I think a far bigger safety concern are crossguards. And I've seen people go into grapples and fall on crossguards or even just drop their sword. And these crossguards are far pointier and more able to penetrate your ribs than any schild is. So I think that's more of an issue. And we'll talk about crossguards next. So working our way up the swords now, from blades to pommel essentially, let's get to the crossguards. So one thing to note is between these standard models, they all have slightly different designs and slightly different lengths of crossguard, but they are broadly similar. They're within the same ballpark, they're all straight. They don't have any hooked bits on, they don't have any balls on the end or anything like this. They don't have any escutcheons or langets or anything like that in the centre. They're all basically relatively simple straight crossguards. Now, in terms of the Sigi one, this is the longest of the crossguards. The Kvetun is the second longest crossguard, and the Regenyei is the shortest crossguard. Again, if you wanted any one of these and you wanted a longer or shorter crossguard, you just ask one. And I have to say, if you want a shorter crossguard, a hacksaw is your friend. You don't necessarily need to pay extra for a shorter crossguard. You just get a hacksaw and a file and you make it shorter. Very easy. These are mild steel for the most part. There is some difference in the design. I'll start off with the Regenyei. So I would consider, of the three crossguards, the Regenyei is actually the simplest because it's very clearly cut, probably laser cut, board cut, not sure, out of a flat bar. So if we look at it this way, it's completely flat. And if you look at it that way, it's got some shape. It has an oval shape that matches the width of the grip, and then it flares out at the end. Now it's good it flares out at the end because that gives you more safety if you fall on the guard somehow or hit someone with the guard. The bars are quite thin, I would say, and I have to say I have seen over the years, I have seen Regenyei crossguards bend. I would say that they perhaps could be beefed up a little bit. Now bear in mind that this is the lightest of the feathers. Now if you're going to try and make a feather lighter, and there are some advantages to this, to having a lighter feather, it'll be quicker, okay, and less tiring to use. If you want to make a feather with a standardized blade, and bear in mind that this blade very closely matches the Kvetun and the Sigi forge in blade proportions. So if you want to make a sword with these blade proportions lighter, one place you can take mass of, as Regenyei Armory have done, is the crossguard. So again, it's pluses and minuses. It's what you want. Do you want an indestructible heavy bar of a crossguard that will never ever bend, or do you want something that's really light that makes your weapon lighter? So an advantage of this guard is that it is light. A disadvantage is potentially it's not as durable. Because it's thinner, quite simply, okay? But it is what it is, and it's fitted very, very well. It fits absolutely flush with the grip. I'll talk about the grips after the guards, incidentally. And there is no light to be seen in the shoulders of the blade. It is flush up against that blade beautifully. There's no gaps. The fit and finish is absolutely fantastic. I'll talk a little bit more about fit and finish as well later in the video. Now, moving over to the Kvetun. So the Kvetun's got almost the identical same blade design and proportions as the Regenyei. Now, the crossguard itself, I actually personally prefer the Kvetun crossguard. It's three-dimensionally shaped, okay, so it thins down and flares out this way, and it thins down and flares out this way. Again, the width of the guard matches the width of the grip, so there's no lip and there's no ugly overhangs. There's no belly of grip over here, which looks really horrible on any sword. So the size and proportions of everything are very, very good. The thickness of this is more than the Regenyei guard. So one of the areas where this becomes a heavier sword than the Regenyei is probably the guard and other elements that we'll get to as well. but the blade, as I've said, is almost identical. So it's a slightly thicker, probably slightly stronger guard. There is one difference, and one place where the Kvetun is actually not as good as the Regenyei, and that's in fit and finish. And I can get my fingernail just underneath, just have a look here. You can probably just about see there. I can just about get my fingernail under. It is totally flush on the other side, so that could just be particular to this one. I have to say, looking along the blade this way, the aperture cut in the guard is, you can see a couple of drill holes. So the way that these holes are normally cut, unless a CNC machine or a you know, like a laser cutter or something like that is used, if it's being done by hand, which Kvetun I think do, then you'll probably drill a series of holes and then you cut those holes together to get the slot. This one you can actually see there's a little bit of roughness along the hole. So I would say out of these two, the Regenyei is cut more tidy. It's a tidier slot essentially that fits more flush. So I prefer the Kvetun guard to the Regenyei guard, but the fit and finish of the Regenyei guard is slightly superior to the Kvetun guard. Now the Sigi guard is a funny one because on one hand it's more ornate and on another hand it's actually far simpler than the other two. So we've already said it's a bit longer, but length is arbitrary to an extent. But anyway, on the standard version it's a slightly wider guard, which I should mention incidentally does give you a bit more hand protection. A larger guard, it's more likely to get in the way, it's more likely to get caught in things, and it has a slight bit more rotational inertia to it in theory, though you might not even feel that. But it does give you a bit more hand protection, marginally. But this is actually simpler in that this is clearly cut out of a flat bar, so it's completely flat in this direction and only has a very, very slight bit of shape. It swells slightly so that it's the same width as the grip, very slightly wider than the grip. Here, okay, so it's a guard that it looks fine, there's nothing wrong with it, and there's plenty of historical swords which have guards that are this simple. Now the sense in which it's more ornate is they've put some little file lines on here, and this is the nice little decorative touch that Sigi have gone with, I think, to try and make their feathers look different to other people's and stand out and look maybe a little bit more handmade in a sense, a little bit more like artisan products. And I actually really appreciate that. And although it's a tiny thing, and I could put those, you know, 3 file lines in here on each side and the same on the other side, I could do that probably in under 10 minutes. It's not like it's a complicated or advanced skill filing some lines in a piece of mild steel, but it does elevate, it does do something, it does give the sword a bit more character. And I have to say, I'm actually very familiar with 2 original federschwerts that are kept in Arundel Castle in Sussex, which is not that far from me and I visit fairly often. And it has a little bit more of a feel of one of those. It looks more like a medieval handcrafted product than a machine product. And I have to say, the Regenyei and the Kvetun do look a bit more machine, but we'll talk about overall look and fit and finish towards the end of the video. So in that sense, the guard's got a bit more decoration, but in the other sense, the guard's actually simpler. It doesn't narrow and swell in the way that the others do in either plane, really. It just has this swell at the middle. I would say, therefore, that the Sigi crossguard is slightly more dangerous. Now, I have only ever seen someone fall on a crossguard once, and it was very, very nasty. But via the medium of the internet, I am aware of the fact that it's happened more in the world and that crossguards have injured some people. Pretty much always in grappling and falling on the sword. But when you drop a sword, it doesn't always drop flat, sometimes drops on the end. And if you're falling at the same speed as it, it doesn't get out of the way before you fall on it. Quite nasty. And I have to say, if we just can take the biggest of these 2 ends, which is the Kvetun, if we look at the ends there, you can hopefully see that the end of the Kvetun is substantially bigger than the end of the Sigi crossguard. And if I was going to fall on either of these, you can guess which one I'd rather fall on. I'd much rather fall on the Kvetun crossguard than the Sigi Forge crossguard, which is a shame because I really love the look of the Sigi Forge, but if I'm really nitpicking, I have to say those crossguard ends are not quite as safe. In terms of the fit and finish, it is really, really good on the Sigi Forge, okay? The line along there that I can see the aperture for the tang, for the blade to go through, is really straight. I don't know how they've done it so straight, actually. It's beautifully tidily done. And there are no gaps. There's nowhere to get any nail in there at all. beautifully flush and finished. So very, very nice fit and finish on that part of the sword. And also the guard, there's no junction, there's no lip. The thickness of the grip perfectly matches the thickness of the guard. So very, very good fit and finish. I would personally prefer to see bigger ends on that crossguard and, you know, maybe a bit more three-dimensional shape to it as well. So next up to compare between these three feathers, which are, you know, fundamentally relatively similar, I suppose, is the grips. Now, the grips do have some variation. On your screen, they may look very, very similar. They're all black. They're all made of cord. But breaking it down a bit further than that, there are some differences. Right, first up, I will deal, as always, with the Regenyei. So the first things to say about the grip is that the grips on the Regenyei are very durable. I'm very familiar with these in use, but there have been some changes over the years. All three of these weapons are roughly year and a half old. They're all essentially brand new though, in that they haven't been used. Now, obviously, durability is something that I can't review necessarily on this video on these specific swords because they'd need to be in use by an individual or within a club for some amount of time. And these will be in use in my club, so maybe I'll come back. I'm going to look at some aspects of durability in this video, but obviously I can't so much look at durability of the grips in a straightforward sense within the parameters of this video. But in terms of the cord, so Regenyei version cord is very nice quality cord. If I just come up close to the camera, you can hopefully see it's quite fine. And that provides a very nice grip. If it makes any kind of sense, a kind of detailed grip, in that there is obviously texture to the grip, but that texture is low-lying. The cord is very, very tight. There's no movement or anything like that. There's no squidginess to it. And obviously the actual sort of don't know how to describe it. I suppose the twist of the cord or twine is quite small. It's quite narrow diameter, and that actually, as I say, it gives a smooth but quite texture-rich grip. Very, very nice grip, I have to say. And we'll talk about the others in comparison in a moment. The other thing to talk about is the fit relative to the pommel and the crossguard. And in the case of the Regenyei, it is exactly the same width in both directions at the pommel, and it's exactly the same width as the crossguard here. So that's great. In terms of the cross section, it's quite flat. So actually think a little bit more than an oval. This is actually more like a flattened rectangle in a way, or kind of it's two flat planes with semicircles at front and back. And I actually really, really like that. And it certainly helps with the kind of edge alignment. You can feel, you can index exactly where the edge is without needing to interact necessarily with the flat of the blade, which obviously if you're doing certain German systems, you'll often have the flat on the underneath of the blade, underneath the shield, but without necessarily having to do that, or indeed to sort of mess with the crossguard, as it were. In reality, you often will be up near the crossguard, but even if you're not, you can still feel which direction the edge is pointing in. Moving on to the similar in overall appearance Kvetun or Kvetun. This grip is a little bit different. So the first thing you'll notice about it, so I've actually owned a number of Kvetun feathers over the years, federschwert, and they all had leather covered grips. Now Kvetun do traditionally tend to put stitched leather on most of their grips, but they do offer a corded grip on the feather, which makes it more similar to the other swords that are being compared to here. So obviously if you had the leather wrapped grip, that would be something to remark on, that it's quite different to the others, but this is relatively similar. There are some differences, and the first thing that will strike you is that the cord of the Kvetun is shiny. I don't know if you'll be able to really see that much on camera, but it's got quite a shiny nylonish surface, and the individual cord is thicker. That does mean that whilst the grip on this sword is okay, I would say it's not as nice as the Regenyei grip. It strikes me as a cheaper type of cord. I also suspect it's not as durable, but again, I can't physically test that here and now. but I suspect that this is more likely to fray and more likely to get damaged from being hit. And remember, of course, specifically with two-handed swords, often they get hit between where the gloves are. And of course, there's the interaction between the glove, if you're wearing something like a Spez Heavy or something which has got a hard shell, and the actual surface of the grip. So you will get wear and tear on these grips. Now, I'm not going to be overly critical of these grips for that reason, because you can rewrap them, you can recover them relatively easily. But I would say that the Kvetun grip is not such a nice quality cord as the Regenyei grip, okay, on this particular example. And I have to also say that I've seen a number of Kvetun feathers over the years, as I say, and they've all been leather covered. I've never actually seen one with a cord grip before, so maybe that's a more recent thing, I'm not really sure. In terms of the fit, it is the same thickness as the guard down here, and it is the same thickness as the pommel, but there's a different pommel design with the Kvetun, and we'll get to the pommel in due course. There is one other thing which I would say about the Kvetun grip, and that it is more ovoid. It is more oval, it is a little bit more round than the Regenyei grip. The Regenyei grip is flatter, which I personally prefer. The Kvetun grip, on the other hand, is slightly fatter. Now, that's personal preference. I personally, 100% out of these two grips, prefer the Regenyei grip over the Kvetun grip. For all the reasons mentioned, it's got nicer quality cord, it's a more detailed grip, it's got more friction to the grips, it's less shiny, and I think it's probably going to be more durable, and it's a flatter section grip. So I prefer the Regenyei grip out of these two, but if you prefer a slightly fatter grip, and also this is very slightly longer, then you might prefer the Kvetun. Now let's come on to the Sigi forge grip. Now, funnily enough, the Sigi forge grip appears to have been coated somehow, and that, funnily enough, actually gives it a classier look if you're familiar with high-end reproduction sharp swords. By that I mean swords from, well, I won't name other makers in this video because I don't think it's fair, but you know, high-end replica sharp swords. You can think of some famous makers. And usually those grips are cord bound and then have leather over the top. Now the funny thing is, by putting this kind of glossy finish, presumably some type of coating, I don't know what it's made of, some kind of varnish or something, that actually looks quite like a leather, like a thin coating of leather over cord. It's actually got quite a nice look, and it looks pretty strong as well, because the fabric of the cord, unlike at the other end of the spectrum, the Kvetun, for example, the Kvetun looks quite fluffy, if that makes sense, like the cord can be got at and can be deconstructed fairly easily. Like if I took a sharp knife and ran it down the Kvetun, I expect it would cut the cord open, whereas if I run it down this one, I don't think it would, because it's all been sort of homogenized underneath this coating. So that aside, it's got a different finish on it. That aside, it is still black cord. It's slightly rougher, coarser cord than the Regenyei. So again, I would say that the Regenyei has got the best quality cordage on it, the best quality twine with the nicest finish, but the Sigi does have a nice look to it that accidentally looks quite like a leather surface that we find on high-end swords. Now, in terms of the sort of shape and size of the Sigi forge grip, it meets completely flush with the guard, as it should. It meets completely flush with the pommel, different style of pommel. We'll talk about that in a second. And you know, there are no joins or seams or anything like that. It's all tightly bound. There's no movement in the grip. It seems absolutely solid. Obviously there's wood underneath with all of these. And in terms of the cross section, it is relatively oval. It's not particularly flat. I mean, it is wider this way than this way, so it is like a squished oval, but it's not quite as rectangular as the Regenyei grip. So I personally prefer the Regenyei grip's cross-sectional shape. And the other thing I would note is that while the Kvetun has the fattest grip, the Sigi has the thinnest grip. So the Regenyei, in terms of grip size, girth, if you want to use that word, is in the middle, and I think it's just about right for most people. The Sigi, you might find it's a bit on the thin side, and you might find the Kvetun's a bit on the fat side, or you might prefer a fatter grip, or you might prefer a thinner grip. Now, I personally, often in life prefer a narrower grip. I've mentioned that in many videos, and I have to say I really like the feeling of this Sigi Forge grip. It actually does it for me because I do like narrow grips. If you like narrow grips, you'll like this grip. If you don't, you might not, and you might want to wrap it with something. The other thing I would say fleetingly about the cross section of this is because it's quite thin and quite oval, you don't feel the edge alignment fantastically, I have to say. So while I would say that the Regenyei gives you the best edge alignment, the best indexing, the Kvetun is probably in the middle, and the Sigi Forge, I would say, is actually probably the worst, despite the fact that I actually really like it as a grip. I would say purely in that one little minute nitpicking aspect, you can turn the grip in your hand with the Sigi Forge, top and bottom. Obviously, often they're cylindrical at the bottom, but at the top they're not usually so much. So it is quite thin. If I try and do that with the Regenyei, it ain't moving anywhere. It's completely locked in to the edge and indexed. So conversely, some people might like that. Okay, therefore the two factors. Number one, some people wear quite big types of protective gloves that might mean that you've got quite a lot of leather on the inside of your hand. So actually that adds effectively to the grip thickness. So you might want a thin grip for that reason, number one. Secondly, there are certainly techniques where you want to be able to turn certainly the bottom end and sometimes the top end in the grip. Okay, if you want to be able to turn the grip really quickly and easily, you might actually prefer slightly less indexing. You might actually prefer this easily revolved grip on the Sigi Forge compared to the Regenyei. So a lot of it is down to personal preference. Personally, of these three grips, for a host of reasons that I've just described, I think the Regenyei grip is the nicest grip. The Sigi Forge is the second nicest grip with some different strengths and weaknesses. And the Kvetun grip is the least nice. It's had the least attention paid to it of the three of them. So let's talk about pommels now. So obviously these are three slightly different style pommels. And I should also add, before I go on, I'm not going to be too critical of any of these particular shapes because they do offer different options, each of these companies. So if you want a different pommel, if you want a wheel pommel, you can have a wheel pommel, or different styles of scent stopper pommel, then you can get them. But these are the standard models and these are quite common. So again, first up I'll go with the Regenyei. So first thing to say about the Regenyei is it is basically a pear shape, okay? It's all gone pear shaped. It's a pear shaped kind of plumb bob pommel, and it has a little groove, if we call it that, going around the bottom round here. Why that groove's there, I'm not entirely sure, but it looks quite nice, it looks quite detailed. The size of the pommel is nice, it's got a nice finish, satin finish to it, and just briefly mentioning, all of these swords are peened or riveted at the end here, and that is a nice visible rivet that is tidily done and looks reassuringly conical, as it were. So you don't want a peen that's completely flat, you want it to have a lot of meat in the centre, should you ever need to tighten the sword up so you've got a bit of meat to work with. So nice rivet, nicely formed pommel, nicely finished, same width and shape as the grip. Fits into the hand really well. Whether you're someone that likes to never touch the pommel or whether you're someone who likes to grip the pommel, either way around it works. Very nice, not much more to say about it than that. If we now go to the Kvetun, so the Kvetun is superficially similar in that it's pear-shaped, but it is smaller, I would say overall, than the Regenyei. It is, you will notice, very slightly, in fact quite a bit, shorter. Now, if you remember correctly, if I put the guards level, you'll see that the entire length of the hilt of the Kvetun is actually longer. So what we've got with the Kvetun is we've got a shorter pommel, but a longer grip. Okay, so we've got more grip and less length of pommel at least. Now, I have to say there's a couple of things which in my mind make this pommel slightly inferior to the Regenyei one. The first one is I do not like the fact that it has this sort of ring or ridge around it here. Now, I've actually got one of these that I've used for years, so I'm kind of used to it, I have to say. And I'm not going to say it gives you any great problem or anything like that, but I just find it slightly uncomfortable and slightly weird because you get your hand, especially because I grip down the bottom down here, your hand gets down to the bottom of the grip and then it encounters a ring and then it encounters something that's thinner than the grip, which is a bit weird because usually pommels only get wider than the grip. They don't normally get thinner than the grip. So aesthetically, we're really talking about here, perhaps even feeling to a certain degree. I don't really like the fact that it steps up for a ring and then gets thinner to a pommel here. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the peen or rivet is a little bit more messy, and you can see that the hammering has damaged the pommel somewhat. Now, funnily enough, I know there are people that sell reproduction sharp swords that have that as well. So, I mean, I'm not hugely critical, and if it really, really bothered me, I'd go on there with a file, I'd smooth it off, and I'd polish it, and I'd make it smooth. But there's not quite as much of the rivet sticking proud. I know that some people like it to be completely polished and smoothed down. That's a matter of personal preference. I quite like having a bit more of a rivet at the end. And I think it would be better if that rivet was done without leaving damage on the pommel, or at least then finishing off so that the damage on the pommel wasn't visible. So overall, I'm personally not really a big fan of this Kvetun pommel. But that being said, there are other pommel options from Kvetun. Now finally, onto the Sigi forge pommel. The Sigi forge pommel is considerably longer, and I actually think, again, this is pure aesthetics and not necessarily practicality, it looks a lot better for it. I find that, I mean, if I take those two, I think the Regenyei pommel's the nicest. I actually think that the pommels on these look very slightly undersized. Now, of course, the balance point is where the balance point is. You can't always get away with putting a bigger pommel on something because it will mess up where the balance point is. But just aesthetically, I much prefer personally the Sigi forge pommel. I think it's a better looking pommel. It looks more in proportion with the sword. And I like the fact that it's actually, in this case, I like the fact that it's quite simple, but it does also look like some surviving pommels I've seen. It looks a little bit more historically correct to me, okay? I'm not a huge fan of those pear-shaped pommels. And also, possibly partly, I'm a bit biased because those pear-shaped pommels are so common on feathers that I like the fact that this has got something that's a little bit different, okay? So this is a bit more similar to a scent stopper pommel. It's got a big amount of rivet material, peen at the end there. There is, incidentally, you'll notice a kind of divot in there where presumably the hammer went a bit skew-if when they were peening it, and they put a rather deep divot. And I would say this has also got some of the same issues. Sorry, just trying to get it to focus. It's got some of the same issues as the Kvetun in that there is some visible damage to the end of the pommel where it's been peened. It's a little bit smoother and it's been finished off a bit better than the Kvetun. This one's a bit more polished. Funnily enough, the actual polish of the pommel as a whole is less. It's more of a satin, dull polish. Those are a little bit higher polished. But in terms of the pommel shape overall, they're all pretty good. They're all functional. They're not a huge difference between them. There's not, we're not talking about one that's really terrible and one that's really great. They're all within the sort of same ballpark. But out of these, personally, I like the Sigi forge pommel the most. I like the Regenyei pommel second, and in this case, the Kvetun pommel, I like it the least. And honestly, I think the Kvetun standard feather would benefit from a new pommel design. Maybe to make it more distinctive, make it more different, but also just because I don't think that pommel's very nice, don't think it looks very nice. And it's mostly aesthetic, not really practical. They all do the job. They all work as a pommel. None of them give any kind of problem gripping. I've got to say I do find the Sigi forge actually the most comfortable one, as well as looking the nicest. So I'm definitely a big fan of the Sigi forge pommel. Right, before I go on to consider some of the more the kind of wrapping up final practical views of these feathers for this first video in terms of durability and warranty and flex and safety and all that kind of stuff, before I go into those, I just want to briefly look at fit and finish, which I'm only going to do it briefly because I've actually basically mentioned most of the points already in this video, so this is really just a summary. But I would say that overall, again, these three swords are very, very similar ballpark swords in fit and finish. None of them particularly stands out from the others as being particularly great or particularly bad. They're all very, very similar. But I would say overall as a group, they're very good. So these are three very well reputed, very well respected makers of federschwert, and all three of these are finished perfectly fine for the price category that they're in, between about 200 euros and 290 euros. I think that's a good price for what you're getting. They're very strong, well-made, practical instruments that are as safe as they can be for their intended use, and they are all overall very similar to each other. Minor details in terms of the fit and finish. So the blade polish, very, very similar. The blade edges, very, very similar. The way that the shilts are finished, very similar. The way that the guards are finished and fitted, there is a bit of variation. So as we saw, the Regenyei is very well fitted. The Sigi forge is really excellently fitted and finished. And there is, in this particular example, I won't say it's true of all of them, with the Kvetun, there is a little bit of gapping and there is a little bit of irregularity for the aperture for where the tang goes through the guard. So I would say in terms of fit and finish of the guards with these, the Kvetun is not quite as good as the other two, and the other two are about the same. We also should mention the grips. I would say that the Kvetun grip is inferior. The other two are both very, very good. In terms of the pommels are all equal in terms of fit and finish, more or less, with the very, very minor detail that the Sigi and the Kvetun have dimpling from hammer marks where the peen's been done, whereas the Regenyei is immaculate. It's as good as a high-end sharp sword where the peen has been done. So the rivet at the end is better on the Regenyei, and it's kind of equal and still okay, but not quite as good on the Sigi and the Kvetun. But I am not such a fan of the Kvetun grip. The Sigi forge grip and the Regenyei grip are better, in my opinion. Now, there is one final, in terms of fit and finish, elephant in the room, so to speak, and that is that Sigi forge very clearly have attempted, with a few small details, to go above and beyond in their presentation, should we say. And that comes back to these nice little filed lines on the guard, the little drilled holes in the shilt, and even the fact that their maker's mark is put in quite deeply. Now the Regenyei maker mark is as well. The Kvetun maker mark is not so distinct, but this is just really, really nicely done. And overall, and also that kind of varnished or coated finish on the grip, overall, this is the most expensive of the three feathers, but it also looks the most expensive, if that makes sense. The fit and finish is not necessarily per se that much better than the Regenyei, but it's just the little details do give it a slightly more expensive or custom look. So now we're going to talk about handling and durability, but I want to emphasize the fact that these will principally be things which are dealt with and reviewed in a future video, a part 2 to this video, when my club has had the ability to properly put these through their paces. So this is very much a first look and first comparison of these on paper, how much they cost, and you know how well they seem to be put together, on all this kind of stuff. But the really brutal testing and using these as fencing tools is yet to come. But on the surface of it, all three of these have a great reputation for durability. I know for a fact Kvetun and Regenyei swords are very durable overall. I have seen each of those break, and I have had each of those break. Absolutely, I've seen Regenyei blades break, and I have seen Kvetun blades break, but rarely, and that is after a huge amount of use or in some bizarre circumstance. I can't personally vouch for the Sigi blades because I haven't really seen them in use much. We don't have many of them in the UK, but from what I understand, they are very durable and very highly regarded, in the same category as the other two here. What I would say is about warranties. Now, I regard this actually as a highly important point because I have seen some blades break, and because of the reasons that blades break. Now, first of all, there's blades that break in use because of damage or work hardening, getting overflexed beyond their elastic limit, this kind of stuff. We can put that to one side, okay? What we can consider is that there is a failure rate with certain with steel used in heat treatment, and occasionally you get a blade that just isn't quite up to the standard, and it breaks, and it usually breaks pretty quickly in use. So occasionally a blade gets overheated, or the heat treatment isn't done quite right, or whatever, and that blade isn't going to survive long. So warranties are super, super important. And with a weapon that gets used as hard and as regularly as a lot of these feder do, I think a warranty is super, super important. Now, so what are the warranties on these swords? Obviously, these all cover normal usage. If you go and try and break a tree with one, your warranty won't stand. But if this is normal fencing, so first of all, we have the Regenyei, so the Regenyei Armory standard feder. Now, a little caveat here. They do some light versions of their swords that don't carry the same warranty, but the standard one, the standard feder that I'm holding here, has a 1-year warranty. Fantastic, okay? Next up, Kvetun. The Kvetun standard model, again, they do light swords which don't necessarily carry the same length warranty, but their standard feder carries a 1-year warranty. Fantastic, okay? Now, at that point, you might be thinking, oh, well, one year warranty is the standard. It's not, okay? Regenyei and Kvetun, two of the biggest manufacturers of HEMA weapons in the world, stand out for their 1-year warranty. That's incredible and amazing for weapons like these that get used as hard, as tough, and as often as they do. For a piece of steel to repeatedly smash into other pieces of steel for a year and be under warranty is incredible. The Sigi forge, despite the fact that it's the most expensive of the three, according to their website, and if my information is correct, has a 6-month warranty. Now that is worth taking note of. If you're paying more money, so 290 euros as opposed to 200 euros for a Regenyei or 220 for a Kvetun, if you're paying more money but you're getting half the warranty, that is worth noting, okay? But there it is. Those are the facts, and I'm just here to report them. Now, I'm very briefly going to look at handling and flex, but as I say, those aspects will mostly be dealt with in a future video, and actually involving other people in my fencing club who actually will get to use these weapons a number of times. We'll film it, I'll interview them, I'll get their feedback. So it's not just my opinion, you're actually getting a cross-section of people's opinion on these particular 3 weapons that I've got here. So first of all, if I pick these weapons up and move them around, they are within a similar ballpark of handling. But we remember the stats in the beginning of this video that the Regenyei sword is lighter. And lo and behold, it does feel lighter. So as we'd expect, this is 200 grams lighter than the Kvetun. So despite the fact that it looks almost identical to the Kvetun from a distance, it feels lighter and it moves more quickly. Okay, it does seem to move around the point. Okay, and it's quite a quick, nimble sword with good edge indexing. The Kvetun feels like it's going to hit harder. It feels like it's got a little bit more authority in the blade, and it doesn't move around the point so much. If we do the wiggle test, it does actually move around the point quite a bit, but not a little bit back from the point. If we take the Regenyei, and there's no good and bad here, this is just different. If we take the Regenyei, hell yeah, the point stays totally where it is. Now if we pick up the Sigi forge, bizarrely, despite the fact it weighs the same as the Kvetun, to me feels more nimble, and I'm not sure exactly why. It could be because it's got a smaller grip, and I like smaller grips, or something weird like that. It's difficult. Now in terms of where it wants to wiggle around, a little bit back from the point, so it doesn't quite stay as stable in the point. Yeah, so to me, the Regenyei does feel lighter and slightly lighter and quicker. The Kvetun feels a little bit heavier and a little bit slower, but it also feels like it's probably got more authority in the blade. And the Sigi feels somewhere in between the two, I would say. So there we go. That is a very, very superficial description of how they handle. Obviously, when we start going into actual techniques and actually fencing with them, you'll get greater feedback from me and other people. Right, the next thing which is super important to know about is flex. Now, through the course of doing this video, it's my opinion that the Sigi is probably the most flexible. It is thinner in the center of the blade. So that is quite easy to flex, therefore quite safe in the thrust, less likely to break people's teeth or necks. If I just push, yeah, that's got quite a nice supple blade. I should also point out that flex isn't only a product of the blade distal taper or the width or anything. I mean, it's partly a product of that, but it's also a product of the steel. And bear in mind, these are all made of similar steel, but they're not made of the same steels. I know that Regenyei blades are made of a German tool steel, I think, or spring steel probably. The Kvetun, I believe, are made of Russian steel, and I don't know about the Sigi forge. So let's get the Kvetun. That's stiff. Yeah, it's really stiff, much stiffer than the Sigi. Yeah, that's pretty stiff. And the Regenyei is somewhere between the two, I would say. So obviously I don't have yeah, it's definitely between the two. Now, obviously, ideally, I'd have a pressure testing machine with a weight on it, or some other way. If you know of a good way I could test this, I'm happy to do it incidentally. If you know a way I can measure the flex force for a certain distance. I know that Wilkinson Sword used to have such a machine, but just from feeling, it feels very much to me, the Sigi forge is the most flexible, the Regenyei is the next most flexible, and the Kvetun or Kvetun is the stiffest. Now, this is the complicated part. So more flexible doesn't necessarily equal more good. It's a question of preference, how you train, what safety equipment you wear, what you're used to, this kind of stuff. Even what fencing style you train in, actually. So the simple fact is that with a more flexible sword, technically, it's probably safer most of the time. The exception to that is if the blade is regularly getting thrust hard into opponents and flexing a lot, then the elastic limit is going to be strained, the blade is going to get strained more, and it will start eventually to work harden, and it will, in theory, is more likely to snap sooner. The stiffer blade that flexes less is, generally speaking, less likely to get near to its elastic limit through normal human energy, because we're all of a roughly similar strength and weight. And so the stiffer blade might last longer. Okay, so that's one thing. If you made a very thin, very flexible blade, it's more likely to break, basically. That being said, a very stiff blade is likely to cause more injury. It's more likely to break ribs. It's more likely to hurt people's throats if they're not wearing the right kind of gorget. It's more likely to ram their fencing mask into their face and give them a waffle or break their teeth, both of which I've seen happen. One of those I've certainly had happen. And other things. It's just going to hurt more. Unfortunately, there is a desire to have stiffer blades. So if I go to the Kvetun for a second, absolutely, if you are going into a tournament and there's no limit on the stiffness of your blade, unfortunately, the elephant in the room with standardization of feathers is that it is advantageous to have a stiffer blade. A stiffer blade means a whole raft of advantages. Two clear ones that I'll mention to you. Firstly, it means you're stronger in the bind. If two blades are in contact with each other and let's say they're flat against flat, which obviously often they wouldn't be, but if they're flat against flat and you push them against each other, clearly the stiffer blade is going to flex less than the flexible blade, and you may well be able to get your point on line to thrust at a time when the person with the more flexible blade can't. That's one clear advantage. A second clear advantage, and this is I debatably noticed in longsword, it's certainly noticed in sabre and rapier as well. If you have a stiffer blade and your opponent's coming towards you with an attack and you stop thrust them, I was doing rapier then, if you stop thrust them, bam, with a longsword, if you have a stiffer blade which doesn't flex, they stop there. Okay, now unlike a sharp sword, because a sharp sword would penetrate, a blunt sword, if you stop the person and the blade barely flexes, they're over there and they're less likely to hit you with an afterblow or a double or whatever. If you have a flexible blade, the drawback, you might not hurt your partner, but unfortunately, or opponent if it's competition, unfortunately the blade flexes means they come several inches closer to you and you're more likely to get hit in the same tempo or with an afterblow. So there we go. I think the Sigi is the most flexible, the Kvetun is the stiffest. Unfortunately, one is safer, although possibly more likely to break in the long run, and the other is probably more advantageous in tournaments. I think it's for future HEMA people, for future math and future other HEMA people, to decide on flexibility tolerances for competitions, because I do think some injuries can be avoided by having blades of an acceptable flex. If you make a sword that's like a crowbar in terms of stiffness, it will be an advantage, but it's far more likely to injure people. So I hope you'll agree this has been a very, very exhaustive and extensive look at 3 feders or federschwert, which they're all popular makes, they're all very, very good, they're all highly respected. I completely back you buying any of these. I wouldn't warn you against any of them or anything like that so far. I also want to reiterate this is part 1 video and probably by far the longest part of the review, but this is the part 1 video. Part 2 video will follow in coming weeks at some point when I've had a chance for the club to properly put these through their paces in use, which may back up some of what I've said in this review. It may contradict it. It will be a learning curve. We're going to find out about durability, we're going to find out about flex, we're going to find out about handling, and it'll be interesting to see the results. But hopefully this first part, which has been pretty exhaustive, will have given you a lot of information to go on. To finish off, I'm going to talk about so far, without having used any of these in anger or friendship, without having used these in fencing, or lent them to other people for fencing in fact, what are my favourites of these swords? Well, there's favourite bits of each of them, okay? But I do have an overall favourite so far, I have to say. So my favourite grip 100% is the Regenyei grip. I love the fact of how flat it is, and I love the quality of the cord they've used. The finish on it is absolutely lovely. So my favourite grip of these 3 is definitely the Regenyei. However, I'm not really a fan of the Regenyei guard for the reasons that I spoke about, and the Regenyei blade is fine. Nothing to criticise about it at all. The Kvetun blade is almost exactly the same as the Regenyei blade. I prefer the guard on the Kvetun. I don't like the grip so much on the Kvetun. I think the grip is a weak point, and I think Kvetun should update the grip. And I also think that while the pommel is functionally fine, I think that Kvetun could put a better looking pommel on their standard feder, and it would look a lot nicer for it. Finally, the Sigi forge. So the Sigi forge is kind of different because it's not the same blade as the other 2. It's not so identical almost as those 2 blades are. It's got a different pommel, it's got a different cross. I, overall, of these 3 feders, actually prefer the Sigi forge for its aesthetics. It has a nice look to it. However, that being said, there are a couple of really distinct standout things that I don't like so much about the Sigi forge. I don't like this crossguard. I like the look of it, and on a real sword, absolutely fine. I think, unfortunately, the ends of these quillons are an accident waiting to happen, and I would much prefer to see a broader flared end on these quillons. If this had a flared end, little ball finials, or just it got wider at the end, I think this guard would be lovely, perfect. I love the pommel on here, I like the grip on here, although it's a little bit on the thin round side. The other thing that I really don't like about the Sigi forge is the tip. I personally prefer rolled tips to flared tips for the reasons that I mentioned. They're a broader surface for thrusts, for spreading the force, and I also think that they tend to magnify the energy from cuts at those kind of points, angles up there. But there we go, and you know, I do accept there are some disadvantages to roll tips. The roll tips theoretically can break more easily than a flared tip, and also in the bind, roll tips can sometimes get caught on the opponent's blade. I have sort of seen it happen. I've never seen it happen in a really bad way, but it can sort of like click over the opponent's blade, which is less likely to happen with this type of tip. But by and large, I prefer the roll tip for safety. So, out of these 3 weapons, I do like the Sigi forge probably the most. However, because of the crossguard and the tip, I probably wouldn't use this as a regular sparring weapon. I would go for either the Kvetun or the Regenyei. And I prefer the Regenyei's lighter and a bit quicker, and it's got a nicer grip on it. So out of those two, I would say the Regenyei is probably the nicer one. But the Sigi Forge does look nicer, but it's more expensive. So lots of pros and cons there, and I would once again reiterate that if there is any particular feature you don't like about one of these and you're ordering one, you can get it changed, okay? You might have to wait a bit longer, and you might have to go directly to the manufacturer instead of through a reseller. But nevertheless, if you want a different tip, if you want a different pommel, you want a different crossguard, these things can be achieved for not too much more money. Especially if you go to Kvetun or Regenyei. I know that they're both very good and quick and accommodating at those changes, at those different things. I don't personally know whether Sigi Forge are also equally good and quick at doing those things, because I've never personally purchased from Sigi Forge yet, but I am impressed with their sword here. And also, the final thing I would say on this video is, once again, these are all three of these feathers are very much in the same ballpark. And if you just prefer the look of one of them, or even if one of them is just easier for you to get hold of, or is a bit cheaper, then go for it. You won't be disappointed with any of these three. They are all good. But, as I said, look out for part 2 of this review, because whilst this has been very long and very detailed, these swords haven't been used in this video, and the next part 2, will be about using these things, and also not just my views and my preferences, but other people in my club, because some of them who you know, other people in my club, prefer completely different things. They might prefer a smaller grip or a fatter grip or a certain type of tip. So let's see what they say as well. I hope this has been useful. Thanks awfully to the people that sent me these to review and test. Hugely appreciated, and hopefully hugely useful to all of you out there watching this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.